The silence was the heaviest thing in the house. It was a thick, suffocating blanket that had settled over the Prescott estate the moment the last car crunched its way down the long gravel driveway. The funeral was over. Arthur was gone. Helen Prescott sat in her late husband's study, the scent of old leather, pipe tobacco, and his familiar cologne still clinging to the air like a phantom. She ran a trembling hand over the worn arm of his favorite reading chair, its deep burgundy velvet cool beneath her touch. For 40 years, this house had been a symphony of life, of laughter, arguments, the clatter of silverware during family dinners, the triumphant crescendo of Arthur's voice when he closed a business deal. Now, all that remained was the funereal ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each second a small, metallic hammer striking her heart. Her stepson Richard appeared in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the afternoon light. He was holding 2 glasses of amber liquid. "Thought you could use this," he said, his voice devoid of the warmth it should have carried. He strode in, his expensive Italian shoes making no sound on the thick Persian rug. He handed her a glass of whiskey, his fingers brushing hers with a sterile coldness. He didn't look at her, his gaze sweeping across the room, appraising the mahogany desk, the built-in bookshelves groaning with first editions, the oil paintings of long-dead Prescotts. It was the look of an auctioneer, not a grieving son. "The service was appropriate," he stated, taking a large swallow from his glass. "Dad would have appreciated the turnout. Good for business." Helen flinched. "It wasn't about business, Richard. It was about your father." "Everything is about business, Helen," he countered, finally meeting her eyes. There was no sympathy there, only a hard, impatient glint she had seen too often in recent years. "Legacy, family, this house, it's all part of the Prescott brand, a brand I now have to manage." He gestured vaguely at the room. He left a lot of things to sort through, a lot of practicalities. The word hung in the air, ugly and invasive. Practicalities. Her husband of 4 decades was not yet cold in the ground, and Richard was talking about logistics. She remembered Arthur's worries, whispered late at night. "The boy's got a hunger in him, Helen. But it's not for success, it's just for more. He doesn't see the value in things, only the price." At the time, she had dismissed it as a father's typical concern. Now the words echoed with chilling prescience. "Your father and I built this life together," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The practicalities can wait." Richard gave a short, humorless laugh. "That's the thing about the world, Helen. It doesn't wait. But don't you worry your head about it." He finished his drink in another gulp and set the glass down with a decisive click on a stack of Arthur's papers. "I'll handle everything from here on out. You just rest." The words were meant to sound reassuring, but they felt like a dismissal, a gentle but firm push to the periphery of her own life. As he walked out, leaving her alone with the ghosts and the ticking clock, Helen felt a dread colder than any grief. He had not come to comfort a widow. He had come to inspect his inheritance and stake his claim on the empty throne. 2 days later, Richard requested her presence in the formal dining room. The room, designed for lavish celebrations, felt like a courtroom. The long mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the grim set of Helen's face and the cool, composed expression on Richard's. He had a slim leather briefcase open beside him, a stack of papers neatly squared at his right hand. He had dispensed with the pretense of mourning. He was dressed in a sharp navy suit, every inch the corporate raider. "Helen, I wanted to handle this privately and with dignity," he began, his tone patronizingly smooth. "Handle this privately to avoid any confusion moving forward." He slid a thick document across the table. The cover page read, "The Last Will and Testament of Arthur B. Prescott." Helen stared at it. "Arthur's will is with our lawyer, Mr. Abernathy. We signed it together 5 years ago." "An older version, yes," Richard said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Dad made some updates more recently. This is the final, binding document, notarized and filed correctly." He tapped a page. "I'll get straight to the point. Due to some unfortunate financial realities I've uncovered, Dad saw fit to consolidate the estate. He has named me the sole heir and executor. The business, the portfolio, the properties, including this house." The air left Helen's lungs. It was a physical blow. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's impossible. Arthur would never— He loved me. He would provide for me." Richard's face hardened, the mask of civility slipping. "He did provide for you, Helen. For 40 years. He gave you a very comfortable life." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "The truth is, Dad's finances were a wreck. He was sentimental. He held on to failing assets. He overspent on things. This house, the gardens, the staff. It's a massive drain. He was nearly bankrupt." He sat back, feigning a weary sigh. "He left it all to me so I could salvage what's left of the Prescott legacy. It's a burden, frankly, but one I must bear for his sake." It was a lie. Helen knew it with every fiber of her being. Arthur had been meticulous, brilliant, but she was disoriented, grieving, and the thick, jargon-filled document in front of her was designed to intimidate. She saw her husband's signature on the last page. It looked right, but the context felt utterly, profanely wrong. "What does this mean for me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "It means you don't have to worry about a thing," Richard said, the false kindness returning. "I'm not a monster. Of course you can continue to live here. Think of yourself as a guest, a lifelong guest of honor." A guest. The word was a slap. In the home where she had raised a family, nursed fevers, hosted holidays, and loved a man for a lifetime, she was now a guest. The magnificent house, with its sun-drenched rooms and cherished memories, had just transformed around her. Its walls were no longer a comfort, but the bars of a gilded paper cage. Richard had not just taken her inheritance. He had taken her identity, demoting her from matriarch to dependent with the stroke of a pen. He stood up, snapping his briefcase shut. "I'll start making the necessary arrangements. There will be changes, of course, for efficiency's sake. You'll barely notice." But Helen knew she would notice every single one. The changes began not with a bang, but with a slow, creeping decay. Richard's idea of efficiency was, in reality, a calculated campaign of neglect. The first to go was the gardening staff. Arthur had employed a team of 3 who treated the sprawling gardens as a living masterpiece. The prize-winning roses, the meticulously sculpted topiaries, the vibrant beds of seasonal flowers. It was Arthur and Helen's shared pride. Richard dismissed them all with a curt email about unnecessary overhead. Within a month, the rot set in. Weeds pushed their way through the flagstone paths like tiny green insurgents. The roses grew leggy and blighted, their heads drooping with brown-edged petals. The lawn turned a patchy, sickly yellow. Looking out the window at the wilting garden felt like watching a beloved friend waste away. Inside the house, a similar entropy took hold. The weekly cleaning service was canceled. A fine layer of dust began to coat the gleaming surfaces, dulling the mahogany and gathering in the corners like gray snow. Richard treated the historic home like a corporate crash pad. He left takeout containers on the marble countertops of the kitchen and propped his feet, shoes and all, on a delicate 18th century ottoman. His phone calls echoed through the halls, loud and aggressive conversations about zoning laws, demolition permits, and land value. "The real money isn't in the relic, it's in the acreage," he boomed into his phone one afternoon, standing in the grand foyer, not even bothering to notice Helen standing on the landing above. "Tear it down, subdivide it into a dozen McMansion plots. That's the ticket." He brought his partners by, slick, sharp-suited men who walked through the rooms with the same rapacious eyes as Richard. They tapped on walls, measured windows with laser devices, and spoke of the house in the past tense, as if it were already a ghost. During one such visit, Richard gestured towards Helen, who was reading in the library. "Don't mind her," he said to the developers, his voice carrying easily. "She's just a fixture. Comes with the house for now." The men offered tight, uncomfortable smiles in her direction before turning back to their blueprints. The humiliation was a physical ache, a constant, low-grade fever. He delighted in belittling her. He would forget to include her when ordering dinner or mock her attachment to certain objects. "Honestly, Helen, who needs this much porcelain? It's just clutter," he'd sneer, walking past the china cabinet. He was dismantling her life piece by piece, not just by neglecting the house, but by trying to convince her that her memories, her tastes, and her very presence were worthless. He wasn't just planning to sell the land. He was trying to erase her, to make her feel as old and useless as the relic he was so eager to destroy. Each day, the beautiful home felt less like a cage and more like a tomb she was being forced to share with its executioner. Into this oppressive gloom, a small bright light appeared. Helen's granddaughter, 7-year-old Lily, came to stay for the weekend. The moment her son, Helen's stepnephew, a gentle soul who tried to stay out of Richard's orbit, dropped her off, the house seemed to take its first real breath in months. Lily was a whirlwind of blonde pigtails, scraped knees, and incessant, wonderful questions. She didn't see the dust or the dying garden. She saw a castle full of adventure. "Grandma, can we make cookies in the big kitchen? The one with the shiny island?" she asked, tugging on Helen's hand, her eyes wide with excitement. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Helen felt a genuine smile reach her eyes. "Of course, my love," she said, her voice thick with emotion. They spent the afternoon in the kitchen, a room Helen had avoided since Richard had taken it over. They covered the marble countertops in a fine dusting of flour, a welcome change from the grime. Lily chattered endlessly, her high-pitched voice a melody that chased the shadows from the corners. She told Helen about school, about her loose tooth, about a dream she'd had where a squirrel taught her how to fly. As Helen watched her granddaughter meticulously place chocolate chips on each cookie, a fierce, protective love surged through her. This house wasn't just a collection of antiques and property lines. It was a repository of memories, a legacy of love meant to be passed down. It was the place where Lily's father had taken his first steps, the place where Lily herself should be able to visit and feel the warmth of her family's history. Richard was home that weekend, mostly sequestered in the study for conference calls. He emerged briefly, scowling at the mess in the kitchen. "Try to keep it contained," he grumbled, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge before disappearing again. Lily wrinkled her nose after him. "Uncle Richard is grumpy," she whispered to Helen. "Yes, darling, he is," Helen whispered back, sharing a conspiratorial glance. That small moment of solidarity was more strengthening than anything she had felt in months. Later, Lily pulled out an old photo album she had found on a low shelf. "Is this Grandpa Arthur?" she asked, pointing to a faded picture of a young, smiling Arthur holding a tiny baby. "It is," Helen said, her heart aching with a sweet nostalgia. "And that baby is your father." They sat together on the sofa for an hour, turning the thick, creamy pages. Helen told stories of the man in the photographs, bringing him back to life through her words. Stories of the man. Lily's presence was more than a distraction. It was a potent reminder of what she was fighting for. It wasn't just a house. It was for Arthur's memory. It was for the future, for Lily and the generations to come. The gloom hadn't vanished, but for the first time, Helen felt a flicker of her old strength returning. A ray of sunshine had pierced the clouds, and she was determined not to let it be extinguished. On Sunday afternoon, a light rain began to fall, trapping them indoors. "I'm bored," Lily declared, flopping dramatically onto a chaise lounge. "Let's play a game." "What game would you like to play?" Helen asked, setting aside her book. Lily's eyes lit up. "Hide and seek. This house is the best for hiding." Helen smiled. "All right, you hide, and I'll count to 100. She covered her eyes in the grand foyer, the familiar cadence of counting filling the silent house. 98, 99, 100. Ready or not, here I come. She began her search on the ground floor, checking behind curtains and in closets, calling out playfully. She knew Lily's favorite spots. But after checking them all, there was no sign of her. A little thrill of surprise went through her. The girl had found a new spot. Helen ascended the grand staircase to the second floor, her steps creaking on the old wood. Still no Lily. That left only one place, the attic. The door was at the end of the hall, small and unassuming. With a groan of protest, she pulled down the folding ladder and climbed into the vast, shadowy space under the eaves. Shafts of dusty light cut through the gloom from a single dormer window. The air was thick with the scent of cedar, dust, and time. Forgotten furniture stood like shrouded ghosts under white sheets. "Lily!" she called out, her voice echoing in the stillness. "I'm coming to find you!" A tiny giggle erupted from the far corner, behind a stack of old steamer trunks. As Helen made her way over, she saw Lily emerging from the shadows, her face smudged with dust but triumphant. "You found me!" she squealed. Then her expression turned serious, her eyes wide. She pointed to a dark shape nestled deep in the corner she had just vacated. "Grandma, look what I found!" Helen peered into the dusty recess. Tucked away behind the trunks was a heavy, sea-worn chest. It was made of dark, scarred wood, bound with tarnished brass straps. It wasn't a fancy heirloom. It looked rugged, like something a sea captain would own. A heavy, rusted padlock secured its lid. "Oh my!" Helen breathed, running her hand over the rough lid. She didn't recognize it. It must have been something Arthur had stored up here long ago. Lily's voice was a reverent whisper. "It's the treasure. Grandpa told me his real treasure was hidden up here." Helen looked at her, puzzled. "When did Grandpa tell you that, sweetheart?" "A long, long time ago," Lily said with the charming vagueness of a child. "When we were in the garden. He said a pirate's chest had his best treasure, and this is it." Together, they tried to pull the heavy chest out into the light. It was incredibly heavy. As they dragged it, the rusted hinge of the padlock, weakened by decades of damp and disuse, suddenly gave way with a sharp crack. The lock fell to the floor, and the lid creaked open a few inches. A puff of stale air escaped. Heart pounding with a strange mix of curiosity and premonition, Helen knelt down beside her granddaughter and slowly, carefully lifted the lid. The chest did not contain pirate gold or glittering jewels. There was no treasure, not in the way Lily had imagined. The space was filled almost to the brim with neatly bundled letters, old photographs, and a few of Arthur's personal effects: his first fountain pen, a worn baseball glove from his childhood, a silver locket containing a tiny, faded picture of her. But resting on top of it all were two items that made Helen's breath catch in her throat. The first was a thick, leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with Arthur's initials. The second was a large, crisp manila envelope, sealed with wax, bearing the official letterhead of their family lawyer, Mr. Abernathy. Her hands trembled as she lifted the journal. It felt warm, alive, as if it still held the heat from her husband's hands. Lily, her curiosity about treasure now replaced by the solemnity of the moment, sat quietly beside her. Helen opened the journal to the last entry, dated just 3 weeks before Arthur's death. His familiar, elegant script filled the page. "The doctors have confirmed what I already suspected in my bones," the entry began. "This old heart of mine is a ticking clock, and it's about to strike midnight. I am not afraid of what comes next, but I am terrified of what I am leaving behind. My greatest failure is my own son. I see the greed in Richard's eyes. He looks at my life's work, at this beautiful home I have built with my darling Helen, and he sees only dollar signs. He does not understand that a legacy is not a balance sheet. It is love. It is history. It is the shade of an oak tree you planted for a grandson you may never meet." Tears welled in Helen's eyes, blurring the words. She read on, her heart aching. "He will try to take it all from her. I know he will. He will paint me as a fool, and her as a burden. He will try to tear down these walls that have held so much joy, walls that have absorbed the laughter of our children and grandchildren. He thinks me a sentimental old man, and perhaps I am. But I am not a stupid one. I have spent the last 6 months preparing for his betrayal. It is a terrible thing to have to build a fortress against your own blood, but I will not allow him to destroy everything. I will not allow him to hurt my Helen." The entry ended with a final, heartbreaking line. "The real treasure was never the money. It was the life I built within these walls with her. I hope she finds this. I hope she knows how much I loved her, and how I tried, even from beyond the grave, to protect her." Helen closed the journal, hugging it to her chest as sobs shook her body. They were not just tears of grief, but of profound, overwhelming love and gratitude. Arthur had known. He had seen it all coming. He had not abandoned her. He had been working to save her. Wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, she picked up the sealed envelope. Her fingers, now steady and resolute, broke the wax seal. Inside was a thick, legally binding document. On the cover page, in stark official type, were the words, "The True Last Will and Testament of Arthur B. Prescott." With Lily playing quietly with the old baseball glove, Helen sat in a dusty shaft of attic light and read the document that Arthur had so carefully hidden. It was not the convoluted, predatory text Richard had shown her. This will was clear, concise, and filled with Arthur's true voice. The opening paragraphs reaffirmed his boundless love for her, calling her his partner in all things and the architect of my happiness. Then it laid out his plan, a plan so ingenious and thoughtful, it felt like he was in the room, whispering it to her. Arthur, anticipating his son's desire to sell the land to developers, had taken a decisive, irreversible step. "In the 6 months prior to the drafting of this will," she read, "I have worked in conjunction with the State Historical Preservation Office. As of March 12th of this year, the Prescott estate, including the main house, all outbuildings, and the surrounding 20 acres of gardens and woodlands, has been officially designated a state historical landmark." Helen's hand flew to her mouth. A historical landmark. The designation was a legal shield of impenetrable steel. It meant the property was protected by state law. It could not be demolished. It could not be subdivided. Any alterations to its historic character would have to be approved by a board, a process notoriously difficult and expensive. Richard's dream of a dozen McMansions had just evaporated. He couldn't sell the land for development because the land's most valuable asset, the house itself, was now legally untouchable. The will continued, laying out the new reality with methodical precision. "To my wife, Helen Prescott, I leave lifetime tenancy of the Prescott estate. She is to be the sole resident and guardian of the property for as long as she shall live." He had gone further. He had set up a separate, untouchable trust, the one Richard had claimed didn't exist, with a generous annual stipend designated specifically for Helen's living expenses and, crucially, for the upkeep, maintenance, and preservation of the house and gardens in the manner to which they have been accustomed. He had even named the specific gardening and cleaning services she was to rehire. Only then did the will address his son. "To my son, Richard Prescott, I leave my love and my profound disappointment. He will inherit the title to the Prescott estate only upon the passing of Helen Prescott. This inheritance is contingent upon one non-negotiable condition, that the property has been maintained to the standards set by the Historical Preservation Office during her lifetime. Should he fail in this or attempt to challenge this will, the entire estate will be bequeathed to the State Historical Society in perpetuity." It was a checkmate from beyond the grave. Arthur had not disinherited his son entirely. Instead, he had bound him. Richard would be the owner on paper, but only after Helen was gone, and only if the property he so disdained was perfectly preserved. He was trapped, forced to wait and watch as Helen lived comfortably in the very house he had tried to steal, her life funded by a fortune he couldn't touch, all while being responsible for the preservation of a legacy he had tried to obliterate. Helen folded the will, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across her face. This wasn't just a will, it was a shield, a sword, and a final, beautiful love letter. The following Tuesday, Richard's developers, Mr. Evans and Mr. Thorne, arrived for what was meant to be the final meeting. They spread blueprints across the grand dining room table, the same table where Richard had presented his false will. He was practically preening, pouring expensive scotch, and laughing with a boisterousness that grated on the quiet dignity of the house. "As you can see, gentlemen," he said, tapping a section of the plans, "the demolition is straightforward. We clear the whole lot. Maximum square footage for each new build. The profit margin is staggering." At that moment, Helen walked into the room. She wasn't angry or hysterical. She moved with a serene, unassailable calm. In her hands, she held Arthur's leather-bound journal. The three men turned, Richard's face immediately clouding with irritation. "Helen, we're in the middle of a very important meeting." "I know you are, Richard," she said, her voice clear and steady, "and what I have to say is directly relevant." She walked to the head of the table, Arthur's spot, and stood there. She didn't look at the developers. Her eyes were fixed on her stepson. "Before you sign your contracts, I believe you should hear a few words from the man who built this estate, your father." She opened the journal. Her voice, filled with a quiet power, resonated in the suddenly silent room. She began to read the entry Arthur had written just before his death. I see the greed in Richard's eyes. He looks at my life's work, and he sees only dollar signs. He does not understand that a legacy is not a balance sheet. He will try to tear down these walls that have held so much joy. He thinks me a sentimental old man. But I am not a stupid one. Richard's face went from ruddy to pale. But I am not. That's enough, Helen. This is private nonsense. It's his last private thought about you, she said calmly, and then turned her gaze to the two developers who were now looking deeply uncomfortable. And this, she said, placing the true wax-sealed will on top of their blueprints, is his last public declaration. She explained it all. The historical landmark designation, her lifetime tenancy, the trust fund for upkeep, the strict, unbreakable conditions of Richard's inheritance. She laid out Arthur's plan with devastating clarity. Mr. Evans, a man who valued deals above all else, was the first to react. He slowly began rolling up his blueprints. A historical landmark designation, he said, his voice flat. Our legal department would have found this eventually, Mr. Prescott. This property is undevelopable. You've wasted our time. Mr. Thorne, looking at Richard with open disgust, simply shook his head. To treat his own father's legacy this way, and his widow. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They gathered their briefcases, gave Helen a respectful nod, and walked out of the house without a backward glance. The deal was dead. Richard stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent fury. He was speechless, his mouth opening and closing silently. All his plans, all his smug superiority, had been dismantled in 5 minutes by a dead man's words and an old woman's dignity. He looked at Helen, his eyes burning with hatred and humiliation. He was powerless. The house he coveted was hers to enjoy, funded by money he couldn't access, protected by a law he couldn't break. He was left with nothing but his shame. Without another word, he turned and stormed out of the room, the slam of the front door echoing like a gunshot. Helen was left alone in the magnificent, silent dining room. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She ran her hand along the polished table, the wood smooth and solid beneath her palm. The house was safe. Arthur's legacy was safe. She was safe. A profound peace settled over her, and for the first time in months, the house felt like home again.